Thank you so much, Kristen. It's my pleasure to introduce our last speaker, Dr. Michelle Johnson, who is an associate professor of physical medicine and rehabilitation at the University of Pennsylvania, where she directs the Rehabilitation Robotics Lab, where she, and I guess I will keep her intro short since we're a little bit behind on time, but I'm super excited to hear about all of her work in increasing access to rehabilitative robotics worldwide, and also studying the interactions between physical and cognitive impairment in various diverse populations. So take it away, Dr. Johnson. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. How are you? Sorry I was late, got caught up in a bit of traffic. Anyway, let me begin. Okay, so I had decided to talk a little bit about how we've been developing and deploying therapeutic robotics for pathology, for diverse set of pathologies. One, I probably will talk about some TheraDrive systems and Rehab Care's robotic system that has some patents, and there's financial disclosure in terms of a Recupero robotics company that we're doing. Probably since a lot of this talk maybe already covered the fact that stroke is a major cause of disability. It's an expensive problem to have, and that we have a lot of people living with stroke and the residual effects of it, long-term persistence in terms of cognitive impairment, motor dysfunction, psychosocial issues, as well as impairment in quality of life and activity. And essentially what motivates rehabilitation robotics is the fact that we have a growing number of people who need care, currently shortage of clinician, as our clinical colleague kind of talked about, and the need to think about how do we help bridge this gap. Our assumption is that technology can help us bridge this gap. Typically, we're talking about therapeutic and assistive technologies, primarily of which maybe upper extremity, lower extremity, as well as assistive robot systems. One of the things that I've been studying is human-human interaction and trying to think about how, ideally, how the robot should play within the different types of activities that therapists typically do, and how do we help the robot transition between activities. And in terms of our work, we've kind of touched on a variety of those activities. I'll call them helper robots, robots that are like permanently attached to you, assistive and service robots that are looking at demonstrating and observing the activity. We think about what we do when the video is not working. I apologize. When we think about, classic, some of the first systems that I worked on was thinking through a robot like this haptic master robot that can move the limb to help someone kind of do a very purposeful task like drinking, to thinking about service type robots that are, that are augmented. It's a telepresence system augmented with a social robot, thinking about how can we deploy this in the community setting. And then thinking about how do we develop kind of the robot of the future, maybe some type of humanoid robot that will be supporting people with elder care, et cetera. In terms of different populations, touching on stroke, touching on people, older people with motor issues, or possibly older people that are becoming frail due to just aging. One of the challenges with a lot of the robots that we see around is that they're pretty costly. When we think about the pros of rehabilitation and therapy robots, there are lots of pros why we should continue to pursue this direction. They can provide high intensity physical therapy. They can kind of drive in terms of repeatability. They can be adaptive. We can make them semi-autonomous, consistent, repeatable, provide some intensive therapy, get objective measures, reduce impairment, and increase activity. A lot of things that our prior speaker had kind of talked about, But some of the challenges in terms of what we currently have there that's proliferate and available kind of in the more high income countries, they tend to be quite high cost, mechanically complex, huge in size, not that accessible. And unfortunately, when we think about community or in nursing homes or in people's homes, just not that many. And then one of the things that we have been thinking about is just that the transfer of improvement to people's everyday lives have been kind of yay, nay, maybe not as consistent and or as significant as we ideally want them to be. One of my students in PhD student, we began to think through a little bit about, well, what could be at the base of these, of kind of lack of transfer to everyday life, maybe lack of the increased gains that we might see. One thought we had was the fact that when we think about basic ADLs and when we think about instrumental ADLs, the difference between these two are one might be more physical and then the other might involve a little bit more cognition. And when we think about the type of activities of daily living that people do when they leave our labs, it's often confounded by the heavy requirement of cognitive ability. So there's this one study that I thought was really interesting that got me thinking about how do we increase the diversity of the population of people that we treat. And when we think about robot systems, they're often mostly guided and deployed to people with motor issues and not that, and kind of like a lot of people with cognitive issues are excluded or tracked into more of the VR type systems, but the classic robots are often not used with people with significant physical and cognitive issues. The reason why I bring this up is I thought this article was interesting in that it talked about that ADLs, especially instrumental ADLs, require quite a bit of cognitive demand. And when they did a correlation of a manual of the Mini-Mental state exam, which is a cognitive exam, they saw that there were significant amount of cognitive requirements for some tasks that, for example, using the telephone or preparing a meal or doing household, that they may have physical requirements, but they also have cognitive requirements. So one of the things we were thinking was if there's increasing real world cognitive demand that may decrease the ability to transfer ADLs, how do we develop robotic systems that are able to cover this continuum, if we call it a 2 degree of freedom continuum of people with various levels of cognitive impairments and then people with various levels of motor impairment. What we've typically done is look at people with low cognitive impairment. They're pretty much either no or very, very slightly mildly impaired, and think of, and then our robots have been applied primarily to the population with kind of high, moderate to high motor impairments, but very low cognitive impairment. So this is kind of where we normally target. One of the goals was how could we increase the diversity? And the diversity that I was targeting was cognitive diversity. If we can have robots treat those that are both have more than mild cognitive impairment as well as motor impairments, I think that would end up actually broadening the types of folks that we can support. When you look at the literature, majority of the major clinical trials that look at the classic robot assisted therapy, I'm mainly thinking of end effector robots right now. Most of them, again, have particularly excluded the people with moderate and severe cognitive disability. And initially there was a good justification for that because the field was nascent, it was new, there was not a lot of confidence in that people could react fast enough and be that the systems would be safe for those that didn't have good cognition cognitive function. But now I think we've moved beyond that. And so we want to start kind of thinking about how do we do both. We know it's not cognitive commonly considered, but the reality is majority of stroke survivors, I mean, as much as maybe 40% have mild cognitive and maybe even more. So it is not kind of an assumption that we shouldn't consider this population. But then one of the things that we initially did was to kind of think about a population when we were looking into this issue of also mapping our robot systems to a population that's kind of typically not even treated with robots at all. HIV related motor and cognitive impairments. And some people, whenever I say, hey, we've been looking at robots for people with HIV, they're shocked and they say, why? There's nothing, that seems unusual. What's interesting though, and why we go this far is that actually HIV is a population, why we ended up in HIV was we wanted to work with a stroke population in Botswana, and Botswana is in sub-Saharan Africa. And what we were finding in some preliminary studies were that a third of the stroke survivors also had HIV. And that recent research within the HIV population showed that one, HIV was a risk factor for stroke, and that persons with HIV had both cognitive and motor issues. And we actually thought that given the fact that we wanted to deploy our robots in low resource setting such as Botswana, where primarily the stroke survivors may suffer also with HIV, but that there were people with HIV that needed a lot of support, that's kind of where the desire to look at how we could apply our robots in that setting came about. So I have my PhD student kind of look at, first of all, can we measure and assess patients with motor and cognitive disability? And if we can do so, can we stratify them into people who had, low cognitive impairment, low motor, and higher motor impairments versus lower motor impairment? So HIV for us was like, there are 1.2 million people living with HIV in the United States, and it's actually, they're now growing old with HIV. And so there is a new challenge where it also leads to cognitive issues. There's long-term impairments persistent with HIV. 40% of people with HIV will have associated neurocognitive disorder. 70% of them have some type of motor dysfunction, and many of them have impairment in terms of living out instrumental activity. So notice the parallel with stroke, and with this parallel with stroke, that's kind of what motivated to try some of our techniques in this diverse population. One of the key things to recognize is when people look at assessing cognitive impairment in stroke as well as in HIV, we wanted to focus in specific areas: executive functioning, speed of information processing, working memory. Reason is that we believe that instrumental ADLs, that the ones that we wanted to target and the ones that we think that we could assess with the robot systems were within these domains, especially in executive function, which we thought underpinned a lot of the ability of patients to do ADL type tasks. Laura, you know that I can speak because I'm passionate about this area, so please keep me on time. One of the things that we wanted to look at in thinking through how to do so was to identify clinical assessments that are typically used with stroke and HIV population, and then even identify then how we could develop robot-based assessments that could maybe be correlated or predict some of these clinical measures. Some of the ones that we chose for that were stroke was Fugl-Meyer, box and block, grip strength, and group pegboard. And then on the cognitive side, we chose the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, an HID dementia scale. Colotrails 1 and 2 is kind of divorce of a disease type because they measure executive function and information processing and digital symbol coding. This is an example of group pegboard, which again can be used with a lot of different populations. And our goal was to identify a process that, regardless of whether someone had stroke or HIV, one, we could assess them, and two, we could then determine what would be a key intervention strategy for that person. So group pegboard was one of the metrics. Colotrails is information processing and executive function in this case. Very simple, straightforward metrics that could be done with either HIV population or a stroke population. And then the robot task that we choose to use as one first and a primary assessment task was, for example, this tracking task. And a typical tracking task requires you to move the robot. And our robot, if you notice, is a very simple 1 degree of freedom system that we're using. And our philosophy for using that system is that we want to deploy a low-cost robot system to a low resource environment like Botswana. So yes, we could, of course, use a more 6 degree of freedom robot, but that will cost $100,000 US, while this robot that we've been developing in our lab, the haptic therapy drive, our price point was somewhere around 1,500 USD for parts, and something that could also be transferable and rotated and moved around and provide a diversity of movement and therapy activity for the upper extremities. So here you see the robot in a horizontal framework where the person is doing a task, a rotation task that would require primarily shoulder and elbow. And then we can rotate the robot so it's more vertical. And then the person might be doing tasks that would a task that would probably involve them going across body more so. So this first,
I'm going to give you a 1-minute warning.
Okay, sorry. This robot motor task that we have, and then we had this cognitive task, which is essentially a working memory activity where the person essentially had to just use a button. So we loosely call it robot-based. And then this task was a task that was developed in our lab where it put together a what would be inspired by the Corsi block task, where you have to kind of memorize blocks that light up in a specific order. But now you then had to use the robot to move and choose the box. So we're now looking at both your motor length, your motor response, as well as your memory for, and that's what we call it, a spatial span task cognitive assessment. The population that we looked at here, we looked at 15 persons with HIV, 6 that had also stroke. And so we then looked at the combination. Ages were comparable. Years of education, of course, we know that impacts cognitive function. Their MoCA, there was slightly less, more cognitive function in the people with HIV primary. And then in terms of box and block, you could see that the people with stroke had slightly more impairment there. One of the things that we then did was the clinical scores. We looked at the clinical scores and looked at the diversity of patients that we had. So we saw that when we recruited, we just recruited patients with motor issues, but when we tested them cognitively, we found that they had a diversity of cognitive presentation that again means that these are the classical people that we typically would test, but then we had more people down here in the more challenged cognitively. The spatial span task that I was mentioning, we showed that this task was able to kind of separate.
You're 1 minute over. Sorry.
Sorry, I'm gonna if you could bear with me, the no impairment, as well as the motor, those that had both motor and cognitive impairment were more impaired. But what's interesting though is to look at the people that were only motor impaired and the people that were cognitively impaired. What we kind of saw was that, and I think the biggest takeaway was the reason for looking at separately at cognition and paying attention to those clinical measures is that cognition can mask motor function. And what we saw was that those that only had cognitive impairment, but actually had good motor impairment, were actually performing the task as if they were the motor only impaired group, the people that had high cognitive impairment but motor impairment. So what's interesting is that we have to pay attention, take home message, we need to pay attention to cognition because it affects people's motor performance. And in terms of how do we then intervene, what type of metrics we saw. These are the three robot-based metrics that we saw and we were using. So we found one that was sensitive to being able to separate people with low and high cognitive impairment, as well as low and high motor impairment. And then we also saw that our motor measure was able to separate the motor group, and then the kind of a pure cognitive measure was able to separate the cognitive group. So the quick bottom line is that we could then begin to predict and use our motor measures to try and predict these classical cognitive measures. We saw predictions within the R-squared values of 0.6. And then for moderate relationship, we saw in terms of executive function. And then we were able to look at like predict box and block with our robot measures. I think the key thing to take away here is one, with a simple robot system and relatively inexpensive system, we were able to, one, show that we could develop a robot assessment task that could actually assess both motor and cog in a diverse population, HIV, people with stroke, et cetera. And that we saw the importance of being able to classify people by motor and cog, and the fact that we can now have a potential to be able to predict this population on the fly. Why is this important in terms of the theme of the of this workshop? And I think is clinical, you know, at least I work very closely with occupational therapists and therapists. I'm one of those engineers that actually pay attention and don't and talk a lot with my clinical colleagues, is that the real life stroke population is a lot more complex than our typical robotic clinical trials have actually evaluated. We've been focusing mainly on motor, but there's actually a need to really think through what are the stroke survivors or what are our clinical populations struggling with. And many of the clinicians that I talk to say that the hardest population to treat are those that have both cognitive and motor issues. And so I think as a group, in terms of thinking about upper extremity recovery, we need to consider and start figuring out how, one, we can assess very well from a robotic point of view, cognition, but then how can we treat people with these diverse levels of impairment? And I think that's where our lab is going in terms of, now that we can possibly assess this group, can we treat this group that might have more confounding issues because of their cognitive impairment? So I'll stop there.